Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TechGig webinar series, our endeavor to empower techies. We believe that sharing of knowledge is the key to enhance our skills and grow us as professionals. With this principle in mind, we have initiated a series of webinars conducted by industry experts to give you all a crisp insight to various domains. The topic of today's session is eHealth, medical systems interoperability and mobile health. Our guest speakers today are Anura Fernando, Principal Engineer for Medical Software and Systems Interoperability, US LLC, and Laura Alan, Program Manager, Global Services Lead, eHealth. Anura holds degrees in electrical engineering, biology, chemistry, and software engineering. He has 16 years of experience at UL with safety critical software and control system certification and has also conducted safety science research across multiple application domains. He has generated publications in predictive modeling and risk analysis, cybersecurity, systems of systems, software, health IT, apps and medical device safety. So without further delay, I introduce you all to our guest speakers. Over to you, Anura and Laura.
Hello, Laura will be starting off. Laura, you do not appear to be coming through yet. Mohini, is Laura unmuted from your end?
Laura is unmuted, but yeah, now I can see her online. Laura, can you start?
Thank you. Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. You can surely start now.
Good. Thank you so much. I apologize for the technical difficulties there. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon, evening's webinar on medical systems, interoperability, and mobile health. I am Laura Ilan. Unfortunately, got off to a kind of a jumpy start here, but it's a pleasure to have you all online with us tonight. Medical systems connectivity and interoperability is getting a lot of publicity in recent months. Perhaps you have seen television commercials highlighting the benefits of connected data throughout healthcare environments, or if you've read about medical mobile applications market that is estimated to be over $1 billion US and growing. You may also have seen new publications and regulatory guidance and rulings related to medical device data systems, medical device wireless connectivity, and even mobile medical applications. It's likely you've joined us today because you've seen these signs of the eHealth innovation, and our webinar will help provide you with the highlights of the emerging and exciting business and this technology influence in the area of medical devices. As we go through our webinar today, you will be muted. However, we do encourage your questions. We'd like you to use the chat function to type and transmit the questions to our presenters, and we will have a question and answer period at the end of our webinar where we will be able to provide you with additional information. We are recording our webinar today, and you will receive an email link when it is published. So without further delay, let's start. In our webinar today, we will talk about why this topic is receiving increased attention. We are going to talk about new devices enabled by connected technologies and also discuss the need for safe interoperability of these devices. Last, we'll talk about how the use of third-party standards can support manufacturers' demonstration of the regulations for medical devices that are enabled through interoperability and connectivity. And thanks, Anura. So increasingly, manufacturers are leveraging technologies to connect medical devices to each other and also to information systems. We know today that standards like the IEC 60601 require manufacturers to address these risks associated with the connections. The regulations also specify that manufacturers need to alert end users of the risks associated with connectivity including the configurations required to assure safe operation and the consequence of changes of these configurations. So let's talk about an example where interoperability is actually absent. We'll look specifically at patient-controlled analgesia pumps. Not so easy to say at this time of the day. At a recent infusion device summit co-sponsored by Amy and the FDA, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, which oversees one of the largest healthcare systems in the United States for our veterans, stated that patient-controlled analgesia pumps with integrated CO2 monitors could have prevented 60% of the adverse events in 69 root cause analysis related to these PCA pumps. In addition to alarming, an integrated monitor would have halted further opioid delivery by deactivating the pump and thus addressing the risk of opioid overdose. So the absence of interoperability actually did contribute to possible adverse events in the field. In contrast, when devices are connected together, that is when they take advantage of interoperability and risk mitigation for those hazards, which could result from the connectivity not working as anticipated, are not effectively addressed, the possibility for adverse events up to and including severe life and health risks can occur. Another example we've seen is an inmate at a California correctional facility nearly received a lethal dose of a heart medication at the prompting of a newly implemented electronic health record system. The incorrect dosing information was fortunately noticed and addressed by the nurse administering this medication. However, again, without this intervention, adverse events could very much have been the result. With adverse events increasing and as such becoming more visible to the industry and our regulators, the natural consequence is an increased scrutiny for eHealth, mHealth, and interoperable medical devices. We've seen the U.S. FDA recently sent to a mobile medical application developer in India a letter which highlights that when a mobile computing platform are transformed into medical devices through software applications, then the product requires regulatory clearance for the entire system. So then, who is responsible to assure that these new devices meet regulations? Certainly in the U.S., the FDA has made it very clear that manufacturers of medical devices, that is, any product which is intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or which is intended to affect the structure or the function of the body, is responsible for its safe use. We also know that IEC standards also highlight the responsibilities of manufacturers, and in some cases, the requirements for the responsible organization, which is the entity that ultimately places the medical device into service. And what is the manufacturer responsible for? Ultimately, the manufacturer is responsible to determine hazards associated with all elements of the functionality of that device, including the aspects of interoperability and connectivity. And they are then to assure that the type and degree of risk controls or risk mitigations are appropriate and effective. These responsibilities are specifically outlined in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, which is much like the European directives. The Code of Federal Regulations, Part 820.30, includes specific requirements for design controls. This specific law states that manufacturers must establish procedures to control the design of medical devices, and that they must ensure that design requirements address both the intended use of the product as well as the needs of the user or patient. And if software is employed, that software risk management and software validation is completed as a part of those design controls. And we know that while it is other disciplines in an organization to perform our product development, It should be clear also that management at all levels in an organization is ultimately responsible for determining and implementing risk-based decisions to ensure the safety and effectiveness of devices. And again, this includes devices which are enabled through connectivity and interoperability. So at this time, I'd like to hand our presentation over to Anura Fernando.
Thanks, Laura. My name's Anura Fernando. I'm the Global Principal Engineer for Medical Software and Systems Interoperability at UL. And we'll talk now a little bit about how connectivity is becoming extremely pervasive, and it's not only individual devices that are connecting, but systems are connecting to other systems. So as we see, this is not a new phenomenon in the medical industry. If we look at the defense industry, for example, we see that there's been highly structured integration for a very long time. Those of you who may have worked for defense contractors or under defense contract, you know that there's a very highly structured procurement process there where requirements that feed into the system and the system of systems is controlled very tightly. Similarly, in the industrial control space, we saw that this was a very significant issue, making sure that you have very coherent systems. Originally, they were single-sourced in the early days of industrial control systems, and they've now gotten to a point where you have multi-vendor components in these large factory automation systems and so forth. Similarly, in the automotive industry, we saw that under the automotive supply chain, there was a very rigorous procurement process with highly specified component requirements and so forth. And we see that there are many, many parts, many subsystems that are software-based and so forth that need to be integrated together. Then, as home area networks began to become more prevalent, we saw that entertainment systems were interconnected, appliances were interconnected with utilities, for example, heating and air conditioning systems being controlled by utilities to manage overall energy consumption and things like that. And so we see very, very heterogeneous networks implemented in home area networks. And here we see much less control over the procurement process. So when we look at what's going on in some other industries, again using the utilities as an example, we see that there's a great deal of heterogeneity, not only in the technologies that are being used for communication and so forth, but also when you look at the different use cases of these systems, how these systems are in fact used by end users, not only the consumers of power, but also people who have to service the infrastructure, and even folks like firefighters who have to deal with PV arrays on top of homes when maybe they need to climb up and vent the roof to help extinguish fire and so forth. So regardless of what exactly the technology is, when we talk about systems of systems, there are some common key challenges for system integrators. First, they need to understand what can go wrong. You know, what are some of the potential problems with the systems of systems? Secondly, they have to understand what are the design requirements and what are the user's needs. Having improper requirements can often lead to incompatibility across systems of systems. And this is where that procurement process we talked about earlier is a very important aspect of systems integration. Next, we have inadequacy of risk controls. For example, if technologies are extremely easy to use and build systems around, then sometimes we can get into a situation where we don't fully analyze and appreciate the technology and understand failure modes of the technology to understand how to implement proper risk controls. And then, of course, you have your typical issues of time and cost and trying to get onto the market quickly at as low a cost as possible, and then you know, maybe not having the time to consider what kinds of common causes failures could occur, what kinds of redundancy might need to be built in, etc. And then finally, we have this issue of who's ultimately responsible and who should be accountable for the system. When we have multiple devices integrated together, sometimes the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Or another way to look at that is that there are emergent properties in the system, meaning if you take device A and device B and put them together, you have a third function, function C, that arises that's neither solely a function of A nor solely a function of B. And so who's ultimately responsible for that? Is it one of the manufacturers, either of device A or device B, or is it the system integrator? So these kinds of issues can result in some fairly simple types of problems that can be avoided if the right mechanisms are in place to mitigate these types of problems. For example, we saw a while back with the Mars Climate Orbiter that we had the European Space Agency and NASA working together, and they experienced unit mismatches between metric and imperial, where it resulted in mission loss. These folks are some of the brightest minds around, and yet these simple types of errors can still occur unless you have good quality management systems in place that facilitate communication across organizations. Similarly, with the Ariane 5 and the European Space Agency, we saw a floating point value that was too large to be represented by a signed integer, causing one of those large rocket nozzles to go 90 degrees out of trajectory and send a multi-billion-dollar mission out of spinning out of control with mission loss. And those of you who work in the medical device industry, if you haven't yet heard of the Therac 25, I would strongly urge you to Google it and read some of the case studies. This is a case where in the mid-1980s there was transition of software from one hardware platform to another. The hardware platforms were very different. There were no interlocks in the new platform, and improper software verification and validation was conducted. There was no pre-release integration testing before this went into the clinical environment. And that, coupled with an unlikely sequence of keystrokes, led to over a dozen people being injured and or killed just by virtue of the fact that systems integration didn't take place correctly. So are there medical device and health IT risks? Sure. Laura mentioned to you a couple of different scenarios before where you can see these kinds of risks potentially manifest. You can see this in both the acute care setting or more the hospital environment as new technologies are introduced into that setting. Then also as the global need for healthcare increases and the ratio of physicians to patients declines, we see that there is this need for telemedicine or remote care capability. And with that too, there are a wide variety of issues that need to be considered as we'll see as we move forward. So the healthcare ecosystem is growing almost daily. We see people like your primary care clinician needing to interface with a specialist that may be in another healthcare organization, maybe consulting with a multidisciplinary team in yet another healthcare organization, and finally sending information to your surgeon who uses this maybe in real time during a surgical procedure. You also see these organizations having to coordinate with the pharmacies in the hospitals, diagnostic labs, the imaging centers, etc. And then finally, when you're released to go back home, all of this information starts to be integrated so that if a first responder does need to come and assist you, then they have all of this information as well so that they can work as efficiently and effectively as possible. So all of these types of things become possible through the connection between the different parts of the ecosystem via communication technologies, and it's this connectivity and connectedness that creates the world of eHealth and mHealth. And you see that there are a lot of different technologies like servers, mobile devices, laptops, etc., that facilitate this type of communication. So many of us have grown up watching the TV show Star Trek from the 1960s, and we see that the technologies today are far more advanced than what we imagined even as science fiction just a few decades ago. So as these technologies become more and more sophisticated, addressing safety and security becomes an important aspect of what we need to do. When we had fairly simple technologies, it was relatively easy to deal with safety. You only had to really think about your device. And then from a security perspective, you could physically secure the device or contain it so that not very many people would have access to it, and you'd have certain assurances about both the safety and security of the devices. Now, as device complexity has greatly increased, and we have internet connectivity, maybe connection into social media and things like that, the number of touch points increases significantly, and the opportunity for vulnerabilities both to compromise security and to impact safety is much, much higher now. And so we see this in the evolution within standards of the term safety as well. It used to be that safety was defined purely as freedom from unacceptable risk. Now we see that safety is redefined as freedom from unacceptable risk of physical injury or damage to the health of people or damage to property or the environment. And the implications of this have to do with interoperability, because if you have device A now connected to device B and device B connected to the patient, if device A can damage device B in such a way that it causes harm to the patient, now we have an interoperability related safety issue. Similarly, if you look at data and system security, we see that there are now requirements for reasonable protection from degradation of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the system. And regulators have started to recognize this systems integration issue. From the US FDA perspective, for instance, it used to be that FDA had what was unofficially called the accessory rule. And what that stated is that if you have a high-risk device, if you connect another device to that device, then that second device takes on that same high-risk classification. So for example, class 3 for a medical device, as the parent device to which it connects. And we see now that as devices become much more integrated as parts of these complex ecosystems, that type of thinking could no longer effectively hold. And so FDA came up with what's called the Medical Device Data Systems Final Rule, which allows you to look at the differences in risk between these different devices and manage system safety relative to the risk involved in the different parts of the system. And so we can see that in the U.S. There's been a strong leadership role from a regulatory perspective, where FDA, started to look at this medical device data systems issue. Then they partnered with the Federal Communication Commission to look at medical body area networks. New bandwidth, new frequency allocations were set aside for dealing with medical body area networks and removing the wiring in hospitals and so forth. And then they also started to look at this from a home healthcare perspective, cybersecurity, RF wireless technologies, etc. And they recognized that managing all of these things would be difficult, to say the least. And so they came up with things like the unique device identification rule, which causes each of these components in the ecosystem to have a unique device identifier, which is then put in the global unique or UDI database. And finally, they recognize that all of these issues are really being dealt with from the perspective of software. And so they created the mobile medical app guidance that really looks at how apps play a role in this ecosystem. So if you happen to be an app developer, it becomes extremely important to understand the role that your app plays in this ecosystem. For example, is it going on a mobile device? Is your app going to be embedded into a traditional, well-regulated medical device? Is your app or the data going to be used in electronic health records and medical records? So as an app developer or as a medical device manufacturer, you need to have a good understanding of where your device is going to end up in this overall ecosystem. Is it really low-risk software that's going to end up in an unregulated space like personal wellness, for instance? Or is your app going to be embedded into a traditional medical device that is highly regulated, that makes your software equally highly regulated? Have you considered the uses? Is your app just there as a convenience, maybe where the patient is attended by the clinician, but the clinician has some extra tools now at their disposal? Or is your app much more heavily relied upon as your clinician is maybe away from the site of care or the point of care, and using the data from the app and the mobile device perhaps to provide clinical decision support and make key decisions relative to the care of that patient? So in addition to considering the uses, have you also considered who the users are? Are you going to have qualified clinicians using the app? Or could you have any person off the street that's randomly now has access to your medical data and potentially access to controlling your medical device? So when you think about this whole healthcare ecosystem, you need to really ask yourself, have I considered the entire environment? Have I looked at the home healthcare setting? Have I looked at telecommunications infrastructure? Have I looked at my home gateway and the role maybe the cloud plays in this, and central monitoring stations, and how payers use this, and how this gets out to first responders, how this gets out to the hospital and the clinician for ongoing surveillance of the patient? So you need to ask yourselves, what are the risks with safety-related data? As I move data from a point of origin, let's say a medical device, to a recipient, a mobile device, what are some of the things that could potentially go wrong? So as we think about these things, one of the first types of things we should think about is, what about data integrity? What happens if I experience a single event upset or data corruption, where even something like a single bit getting destroyed could shift all of my data and cause some major problems if I haven't thought about the types of risk controls that are needed? What happens if I maintain connectivity between my devices, but I'm unable to transmit the data that I need to transmit? So the information is not provided to the clinician. What happens if there's incorrect timing of the information? So what happens if you have things like stuck buffers and things like that that may be periodically cleared? What kind of response time do you need? How often do you need to check to ensure that you have high integrity data coming through in order to mitigate potential hazards? What happens if you have premature termination in the system? For example, you have a dropped signal all of a sudden. How do you deal with that? If your remote clinician is relying on this to provide real-time clinical decision support and care, is there a way to mitigate this? Is there local enunciation, for example, so that another local clinician might become aware and step in? So again, when you look at this overall system of interconnected devices and interconnected technologies, it's really important to ask yourself, have you considered system safety and security? Have you thought about all of the things that can go wrong and the linkages between all of the parts of the system? Have you thought about this from a security perspective, where nefarious individuals might enter the picture and try to cause harm, steal data, steal identities, etc.? So when you think about these things and address them, do you test to support your safety claims? Coexistence testing deals with how your wireless device and how your app on that wireless device deals with all of the other pieces in the system. For example, do microwave ovens potentially interfere with your device that's in the same frequency band? Are there other devices on ad hoc networks or things like laptops that may come in and out of service on your network that might impact the performance of your potentially life-critical device. There are tests, and several of the guidance documents that we talked about earlier allude specifically to coexistence testing, because the regulators are interested from a patient safety perspective to make sure that bad things don't happen in these types of wireless environments. So we talked about these individuals, hackers, and other nefarious individuals coming in to cause problems, steal data, steal identities, and things like that. There are certain organizations, for example, DoD and the VA hospitals and so forth, that actually require cryptographic techniques to be used on all data within those environments. And UL happens to be an accredited, a NIST accredited, what's called an NVLAP accredited organization that does cryptographic verification for the cryptography protocols that are required by such organizations. So do you test to support your security claims as well? So when you do this kind of testing, you can actually use standards to support regulations. For instance, you can develop assurance cases. And when you put together an assurance case, what you're essentially doing is identifying a lot of the different pieces of your system, your development system. So how did you do risk analysis? How did you gather your requirements? How did you measure things as you were developing things? How do you operate and maintain your system? How do you transition between different life cycle stages in your development process? Did you plan effectively up front before you started developing your app? Do you have mechanisms to assess your project development metrics and have proper controls in there so that you have a high quality output? And there are standards that can help you support these kinds of issues. For example, quality management system standards and risk management standards and even fundamental technical or technology-oriented safety standards. And all of these things can be put together in a way under these assurance case guidelines to help you build a solid case to take to regulators to help them have the level of confidence that your product is ready for the market. So again, we saw in the U.S. market a few months ago, the FDA released a list of 25 what they call FDA-recognized consensus standards that support interoperability. And these 25 standards were grouped in three primary areas. They dealt with managing risk in a connected and networked environment. They dealt with things like nomenclature frameworks, things like IEEE 11073, data structure, and so forth. Dealing with medical device-specific communications and how those issues factor into the overall software lifecycle processes. And then finally, they pulled some requirements out of the industrial control domain having to do with cybersecurity because they felt that these were relevant in the medical device space as well. In addition to these things, there's a lot of activity going on in the marketplace with SDOs, or Standards Development Organizations, right now, and UL is one such standards development organization. We've joined forces with the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation to develop a series of standards for interoperable medical device interface safety. In addition to this, there are the IHE profiles and the Continua Design Guidelines and many other standards that are already out there in the process of being developed further and really supporting this broad ecosystem that you're seeing in the healthcare space. So UL works directly with government agencies, both in the U.S. and in many different countries, to help inform health IT policy and help set the direction of regulation. In the U.S., over this past summer, we had the privilege of working on what's called a Federal Advisory Committee. So here we had the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, which was an act or law in the U.S. that was passed to bring together our three primary regulatory agencies involved in medical. And these are the ONC, or the Office of the National Coordinator, which looks at things like electronic health records and medical records and so forth. The FCC, or the Federal Communication Commission, which looks at wireless connectivity, broadcast, communication issues in general, and the Food and Drug Administration, which has the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, which looks specifically at regulating safety and effectiveness issues around medical devices. And what happened was some recommendations were put together and put forth to the Congress in the United States to help them update the regulations and bring these three agencies together to deal with interoperability issues. So from a purely technology perspective, you all deal with these technologies all the time. We have very sophisticated technologies now. We have infrastructure within hospitals and other healthcare delivery settings, as well as even in homes for home healthcare, to take your wonderful ideas of improving healthcare and turn those into a product or system. And it's important to manage this innovation effectively in the face of rapidly changing regulations. And these regulations have to do with mobile medical apps, with the hospital IT environment and network environment internally, and with wireless medical devices and how they integrate into this hospital IT environment, as well as into telecommunications infrastructure as you deal with things like home health care. So when you take your idea into a product and you try to manage all of this innovation within this context of regulatory change, you have a strong technology framework that you develop. That technology framework has to be moved into a regulatory framework so that you can get your product onto the market. And UL can help you build the safety framework that promotes your technology moving into that regulatory environment. We can be your partner through our comprehensive suite of services that helps you figure your way through this rapidly shifting regulatory landscape and help you securely get your product effectively onto the market. And in order to do this, we have three areas where we offer services. We have the mobile medical apps area, the wireless medical devices area, and the hospital IT area. So we thank you very much for your interest and attention today. And at this point, I'd like to open the floor for questions and or comments. So far, none coming in. Also, please note in this closing slide that there is a website. It's ul.com/eHealth. And there's also an email address, medical.inquiry@ul.com, where if you do think of questions, you can always submit them there, and then we can work with you directly as well. Also, if you need assistance in any of these areas like advisory services, getting quality management systems in place, etc., dealing with wireless coexistence, if you need cryptographic verification for security, please don't hesitate to contact us at either the website or the specific email address. So again, I'll open the floor up. Any questions from anyone? Okay, I think I see a question coming in now. It says, let's see. The app is, what exactly was info provided when the app is inactive? Then we have, can we get some more details about the mobile medical apps that are available? Okay, so the first question, when an app becomes inactive, for example, from an unintended perspective, we see that the device has to go back. So if we're talking about a mobile device connected to a traditional device, then that traditional device should have a risks address state that it enters when it loses connectivity. One of the things that you could do, and there are many different design approaches that can be taken. One approach could be to enunciate. So if you happen to be in an acute care environment, if the device signals or alarms that it's lost its connectivity, that can allow a local clinician to step in and make sure that the local support is provided from a clinical perspective. But again, that's not the only approach to design. This is just one example of many different techniques that can be used. Then the next question was, can we get some details about the mobile medical apps that are available? And here, if you go to the FDA website at fda.gov, there's actually a database there that can be searched of all the types of products that are registered and listed with FDA. And they have a number of different search options, and so you can search for things like application software or standalone software, and find all the different flavors of app, whether it's an app that's embedded in a product or a standalone app that's been cleared under the FDA pre-market notification process. Hopefully that answers that question. And then also the slides I showed earlier, those are actually cleared apps and cleared devices that are currently on the market, so you can look those up as well if you need more information. And all of these products that are out there under pre-market notification, there's what's called a 510K summary sheet that's also freely accessible to anybody through web search on the FDA website. Okay, let's see. Any other questions? Looks like those are the only ones so far. The next question is, are UL services only for the U.S. market or anywhere on the globe, especially in India? So great question. UL is a global company, so no, these services are not only for the U.S. In fact, many of the standards that we alluded to earlier that support the U.S. regulatory process, many of them are IEC and ISO standards, and as such, they're globally accepted, and so we can provide services in almost every market that I can think of and help you gain market access where those international standards are recognized. Let's see, next question.
Yes, and I'd like to add to that.
Yes.
And I'd like to add to that as well that UL does have an office in Bangalore, India, with certification staff within the India market, and we do have folks that can support manufacturers with their questions as well.
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate that clarification. Great point. Okay, we have another question in. Some intro on XML and other data standards, such as HIPAA, for transferring medical data from the device to the other. Okay, so I think what we're getting at is things like data structures and so forth. And yes, there are a number of standards. I mentioned briefly before the IEEE 11073 standards that are used in specific application domains. So there are a whole bunch of these 11073 models around particular device specializations. In addition to that, organizations like IHE have developed these data exchange standards like HL7, Health Level 7, and so forth that allow for data interchange. Then organizations like Continua have put out the Continua design guidelines to use these types of technologies to facilitate data exchange at the transport layer, typically point-to-point. And they also offer what they call connectathons to bring devices together so that once these data interchange formats are implemented, then you actually do real-time connectivity and run some tests to ensure that the devices do in fact properly exchange this data. So hopefully that answered that question. Let's see. No other new questions in. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to add them in your chat box. Okay, looks like one more just came in. Let's see. Says, can we have that address, please? Let's see. Is this presentation available on the UL website? How can we access it? Okay, so I think that's the address that we're looking for. So the conference provider, TechGig, will be distributing a link to a YouTube recording as well as, I believe, the posted slides separately. And so that will be distributed to all attendees after the presentation is done. Also, I believe this webinar or the comparable content should be available on the UL website that you see at www.ul.com/eHealth as well. Okay, here's another question. Is this applicable only for medical or also for in vitro diagnostic instruments? And yes, if you look at the current version of ISO 14971, for instance, you'll see that in vitro diagnostic instruments being in sort of that critical path or the cascading fault path is certainly considered. And so this certainly applies not only to medical devices themselves, but also to in vitro diagnostic instruments. Great question. Thanks. Okay, we'll see if there are any more questions at the end here. Okay, another one came up here. Can you give some advice on how to conduct verification testing for software to cloud mobile medical apps? So first, let me indicate that the cloud or software as a service is another way to look at it, can fall under regulatory purview under some conditions, but it can also avoid regulatory purview under other conditions. And it can have an intermediate role as well. For example, we talked about MDDS, medical device data systems, earlier. And there, this sort of intermediate space, you may need to register and list, for example, if you're using the U.S. market as an example with FDA, but you may not need to go through the pre-market notification process. So what I would ask there is, if you have some very specific questions, that you please contact us so that we can look at your specific product, your design, your intended use, your indications for use in the overall system, and then we can have a much more specific discussion about how to deal with software as a service and cloud services and those types of things. And by the way, this is not only U.S. market, but also in Europe. If you look at the European Commission's guidance on standalone software, you'll see that software as a service or these cloud platform types of issues are considered there as well under IEC 62304. Okay, great question. Any other questions?
Those were the only questions we had, Anura. Thank you so much for answering them all. Thank you so much for the insightful presentation as well.
Certainly.
It was a great session. I would also like to thank all our participants for the support in making this webinar a success. The recording of the session would be available on techgig.com by tomorrow. Thank you all. Have a great evening.